Hi friends, Miss Liz here again, and today we are making some scones. Now this base recipe for scones can be modified really simply. Today I'm making a lemon blueberry scone or lemon mixed berry. You can do lemon strawberry. You can omit the lemon and the berry and do something like add some spices and make it a nice spiced one. I've done diced apples with cinnamon. It's pretty easy to take the base scone recipe and modify it into something else. So you can kind of play with it and see what you think. You can do orange zest with berries is really tasty too, or orange with cranberry. I've done strawberry with white chocolate chips in it. That's pretty delicious as well. So this is a pretty simple recipe to take the base scone and adapt it to what you want. So all that to say, I'm going to show you the basics of what we're doing. Now, one little note, I've had a few friends ask about the lemon zest. If you don't want to go buy an actual lemon to do the zesting, which if you're not familiar, citrus zest is when you take a really fine grater and you basically shave the outside of the lemon or the orange or the lime, whatever citrus it is. There is a lot of flavor packed into the skin of a citrus. And so by using a micro grater, a really fine cheese grater essentially, and zesting the outside, you can get all of that flavor and really nice citrus without adding a lot of juice to your recipe, because adding just plain lemon juice can change the texture of your scone. Now, if you don't want to zest a fruit, you can take some actual lemon juice or orange juice or something like that and do just a little bit, add that into your sugar, and that will, the sugar will absorb some of the moisture. Obviously it still changes the texture of what you're making a little bit, but you can skip the zesting process if you wanted to, if you don't have fresh fruit on hand and you decide you still want to have a little bit of a citrus taste. It's not exactly the same, but it is an easy adaptation that you can make. So what I have here is I have 2 cups of my flour, and just like when we made biscuits, I'm going to take the flour and I'm going to add in my other dry ingredients. So in here I have my 6 tablespoons of sugar, and then I went ahead and put in my lemon zest into the sugar and just mixed those 2 together. So I just took a lemon and zested it. I had to zest some lemons earlier for another recipe, so I just had some in a bag and went ahead and dumped it in with my sugar. So I'm just going to go ahead and dump my sugar in here with the lemon, in with the flour. And then I'm also going to go ahead and add my other dry ingredients. So my baking powder, which is going to be 2.5 teaspoons. And about a half. Okay. And then I'm going to do half a teaspoon of salt. Like that. And then I'm going to take my butter. Now, this is where there are a few different options. You can also do shortening if you don't want to do butter. If you freeze your butter, you can actually use like a cheese grater and shred the butter, and it makes it a little bit easier to break up. Otherwise, if you just have cold butter, you can just drop the stick in and either chop it with your fork, or you can chop it beforehand with a knife. Just depends on how hard your butter is. The firmer and colder your butter is, the more flaky of a texture you're gonna get of your scone. If your butter is kind of soft, you're gonna end up with more of a denser, crumblier texture to your scone. So if your butter's nice and cold, that's when you get more of a flake. Because just like when we made biscuits, anywhere where there's a chunk of that fat, that's where it creates a flake as it's baking, because it melts down in the oven instead. And so you get a nice flake that way. So you can kind of play around with the different methods, using shortening, using cold butter, using frozen butter, and figure out which texture you feel like turns out the best, okay? So in my bowl right now, I have my flour, my sugar, baking powder, salt, lemon zest, and I'm just cutting up the chunks of butter. We want to try to get in between the size of a marble and the size of a pea, just kind of broken up so we have kind of a crumbly texture in here. And just like when we made biscuits, we want to be careful not to overhandle this when we mix it, because that will cause our scones to become dense and tough. And we don't want that. We want a nice, light, fluffy texture to our scones. Okay, so just kind of breaking up those last little chunks. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create kind of a well in the center, kind of digging out a hole. And I'm going to pour in my cream, half a cup of cream. And then I'm also going to crack my egg into there. And then I'm also going to take about 1.5 teaspoons of vanilla. Just going to pour this out. About 1.5 teaspoons of vanilla. Just gives us a nice little oomph to the flavor. Okay. And then break up the egg in that puddle, and then you're just going to pull the powder ingredients from the outside into the center, just like we've done this before. This helps us to very gradually add our liquid ingredients into the powder without overhandling. And we literally just mix until all of the main puddle of moisture has been absorbed. So it looks kind of sticky and a little bit crumbly still, but there's no more puddles of liquid. Then we'll finish mixing by hand. Okay? Kind of get this crumbly, shaggy looking texture once the bulk of the moisture has been absorbed. Okay? Just like that. All right. Then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to add our berries. Now this is where you can kind of choose. You can do a mixed berry. You can do blueberries, strawberries, whatever berries you want to do. I have a mixed berry here, and these are actually frozen. So you can use fresh or frozen. If you're doing frozen, I highly recommend keeping them frozen. Because if you thaw them first, there's a lot of extra juice. You're gonna end up with purple scones. I measured mine out before, so they've started to thaw, so there's gonna be a little bit of extra juice. That's okay, it'll just give my scones a little bit of a tie-dye. But if you wanna keep that nice color of your scones without having a lot of bleeding from the berries, keep them nice and frozen, okay? So about 1 cup of berries, and I'm just gonna very gently fold the dough over to get those berries mixed in, but again, not over mixing, just until they're spread throughout, and then I'm gonna stop. Okay, just like that. All right, so then what I'm gonna do, I have a little bit of a spill here. I'm gonna dry it so my counter's not wet. And I'm gonna take a little bit of flour and just sprinkle a little bit of flour on my countertop. Just like that. Before I dump this scone mixture out onto that, I'm just gonna kind of take my hand, I'm gonna get a little bit of flour on my hand, and then I'm just gonna kind of press that scone mixture down so it's not a bunch of crumbs, and just dump that right out on that floured surface. Okay? Now if it's really tacky to the touch, go ahead and sprinkle a little bit of extra flour on the top, just so it doesn't stick to you. And we are not gonna overhandle this. Literally all we're gonna do is we're just gonna kind of press it together and shape it into a rectangle, okay? Kind of like that. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna take one end and I'm just gonna fold it over. Now those folds, again, are what are gonna give us some flakes in our scones, but we're not overhandling. I'm gonna readjust my flour here, turn it, press it down into a rectangle again, and then one more time, just gonna take one end, fold it over, press it down, and then this time I'm just gonna shape it into a nice rectangle, and I'm gonna cut my scones. Now, I don't wanna press it too thin because I do want a nice height to my scones. So, just like that. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna rinse my hands real quick and I'm gonna grab a knife. So then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna cut this into 3 strips. So 1 here, and then 1 here, and then each of those I'm gonna cut in half. Now the size of scone you make is totally up to you. You could definitely get 4 triangles out of each strip. If you wanna make them a little smaller. If these are gonna be the main dish for breakfast, then I make them a little bit bigger. If there's something that's gonna be a lighter snack, then I make them a little bit smaller. So this one I'm actually gonna get 3 out of this middle section here. So I'm just cutting triangles. And I use either my knife or a spatula to help get them up off the counter because they are a little bit sticky. I'm putting them on some parchment paper so they bake nice and even. Just like that. Slide this one up a little. They do grow a little, but not a ton. So just make sure you're not putting them directly side by side and they'll be fine. Just like that, just see. Okay, now what I'm gonna do now is I'm actually gonna chill these in my fridge, usually 30 minutes to an hour. You can go ahead and bake them like this, but baking them directly from the mixing process, they're not gonna be quite as flaky, and they're gonna get a little bit more crunchy. By chilling them first, that helps keep them a little bit more flaky and keeps them from spreading out quite so much. So chill for about 30 minutes to an hour, and then we'll put them in the oven. All right, friends, so I let my scones chill so that the dough has held up a little bit more. That butter kind of re-solidifies after we've mixed it. And I preheated my oven to 400 degrees. So once your oven has preheated, we're gonna pop those in for about 20 minutes. Just gonna set my timer here. About 20 minutes, kind of keep an eye on them. I would check them around 18, depending on your oven. Sometimes they're done a little bit more quickly. We want them to be a little bit golden around the edge, but not very dark. And so that they look nice and dry, might get a little bit of bubbly depending on how big of your butter chunks were, but not overly dark, just a nice dry finish. If they still look doughy in the center, then they're not quite done, but usually about 18 to 20 minutes is a good amount of time, depending on your oven. So the last thing we're gonna do is we're gonna make a glaze to kind of put on the top. Now you can either drizzle if you just want a small amount, or you can pour it all over the top of the scone and kind of brush it so that it's coating the entire top. Kind of up to you how much glaze you want to put on. But this is very, very simple. We're just going to do 1 cup of powdered sugar. And this is the same glaze I use for several things. I use this for my shortbread cookies. It's really, really simple. Just 1 cup of powdered sugar and 2 to 3 tablespoons of lemon juice. Now, depending on how thick you want it, if you want it something that's gonna be a nice thick, to pipe defined lines, I would just do 2 tablespoons of lemon juice. If you want it to be a little bit thinner, so you can kind of just drizzle it all over and let it run down or cover the whole scone, 3 tablespoons of lemon juice, okay? And then you're literally just gonna mix those 2 things together until all of that sugar has dissolved. Okay, so like I said, 2 tablespoons if you want it to be a little bit thicker so that it has a nice defined line when you drizzle it, or 3 tablespoons if you want it to be a nice thin that can kind of coat the top more or run down. Okay, so just mix until all of that powdered sugar gets nice and dissolved. You can see this is pretty runny. That's how I like it. 2 tablespoons will make it a lot thicker. Okay. If you still have a few chunks of powdered sugar, don't worry, that's going to dissolve. By the time your scones are done baking, all of those pieces of sugar should have dissolved and it'll be nice and smooth. Now that glaze, because of the acid in the lemon juice, will kind of crust over. It doesn't really dry permanently, but it does kind of get a crust over the top. So you might want to cover this if you're not going to use it for quite a while. If you are storing your scones after they've been glazed, don't put them in a completely airtight container because that glaze will soften up and kind of reabsorb into the scone. So you can either not glaze them until you're ready to serve them if you're keeping your scones in an airtight container, or you can just put them in like a cardboard box that has a little bit of air still, or vent whatever container they're in so that the glaze doesn't re-soften. Otherwise, I would wait to glaze them until you're ready to serve. So about 20 minutes in your oven, wait till they've cooled, and then put your glaze on. If you put the glaze on while your scones are still warm, all of that glaze is gonna melt and absorb into your scone. Okay? As always, if you have any questions, feel free to send me a message. I'm happy to help, and enjoy your scones. Goodbye.